Hello, everybody. Nice to see everyone joining us from so many different parts of the world and the country. Make sure I can get a thumbs up if you all are hearing me. Great. Great to see everyone's faces. Good afternoon, and welcome to Thursdays with Friends. This is our online chat conversation on current issues. And the topic of this week is war in the time of a pandemic. This program is brought to you by the Friends Committee on National Legislation, which is a national nonpartisan Quaker organization that lobbies Congress for peace, justice, and environmental stewardship. So many things fall under those categories. I'm the show's producer, Wesley Wolf-Bear-Pinkham, and here's our chat host for Thursdays with Friends, FCNL General Secretary Diane Randall, and her guest Hassan El-Tayyab, who's the legislative manager for Middle East policy.
Thank you, Wesley. I had to unmute myself there. I'm so happy to be with all of our guests here on Thursdays with Friends. This is the fourth episode of our every other week opportunity to chat with a leading expert on issues, priority issues that FCNL works on, and particularly to focus on what's happening now at this time of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm really thrilled that Hassan is with us here today to talk about the work that we are doing on peace in the Middle East and on Middle East policy. Before I turn to Hassan, though, I want to note that the HEROES Act that passed the House of Representatives last Friday had a number of provisions that on the domestic side, we are very pleased with, and in particular, it included new funding for SNAP, food assistance, which is desperately needed in this country. Our focus will be turning to the Senate in the next 3 or 4 weeks, and you'll be hearing more about that in the future. We are concerned whether the Senate will pass it, and we think it's a very important legislation. And significantly, it did not include any increases for the Pentagon, which was an important aspect that we have been advocating for. It also didn't include a lot of the international asks that we have, and you can find out more on our website by looking at some of the materials that, that Diana and Amelia have put together. But right now, I want to turn to talking to Hassan about this. We're going to be focusing on the country of Yemen, a country that has been in conflict for a long time and a war that the FCNL has been paying attention to. In particular, we want to talk about how the COVID-19 pandemic is affecting Yemen. And joining me today, as Wesley said, is Hassan El-Tayyab, who many of you may know already if you're part of FCNL's advocacy teams, because Hassan has been working with our advocacy teams across the country. Prior to joining FCNL, Hassan worked at Just Foreign Policy, where he lobbied to advance a more progressive foreign policy in the Middle East and Latin America. He's played a major role in successful passage of the War Powers Resolution to end U.S. military support to the Saudi UAE's coalition war in Yemen. Hassan?
Hey, thank you so much, Diane. Really appreciate being here with everybody. I'd like to thank our donors for all the support that you've given to FCNL and allowed us to do this important work on the Hill and off the Hill to bring peace to the Middle East. It's a region that's really near and dear to my heart. My family, a lot of my extended family, lives in Jordan right now, and I'm very concerned because they're surrounded by conflict zones on essentially almost all sides, and it's just something that I'm really passionate about and want to bring more peace to the Middle East. With so much going on domestically right now, I think it's really easy to forget what's going on overseas and in the international affairs. And I think if the COVID-19 crisis has taught us nothing else, it's that our country is not immune from what happens in other parts of the world, and we ignore foreign policy at our own peril. The Middle East has been suffering for a long time, in large part due to military action over there, and COVID-19 has only really exacerbated and worsened these conflicts.
So often we say this, and you read this, that the war-torn country of Yemen really has had the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. We've heard about hunger there, we've heard about diseases, and now we have this new pandemic. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what has been happening, what's led to this crisis of the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, and what is the United States, what role has the United States played in this?
Yeah, so it's absolutely devastating, and I've been tracking this for several years at this point, and it's just breaks my heart. There are about 12 million or so people on the brink of famine. 2 million people have been infected with cholera, and this was all pre-COVID-19. The UN is all has been describing this as the world's worst humanitarian crisis on the planet. 80% of the people depend on food assistance for survival, and it's just an awful situation. And sadly, probably the worst part is that Yemen's considered the worst place in the world to be a child, and the conflict has claimed 140,000 children, or at least 140,000 children, since the start, and that was up until 2019. So it's not even including what's happened in 2020 yet. A lot of this has been U.S. support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen. There's been a de facto blockade around the country, blockades of Yemen Red Sea ports. The ongoing closure of Sana'a Airport have impeded the flow of humanitarian goods and commercial food, fuel, and medicine, and has pushed the price of essential goods out of reach for millions of Yemenis. And our country, our complicity is that we're selling the weapons to Saudi Arabia, and we're providing the intelligence sharing and the logistical support for the airstrikes. So we do have blood on our hands by supporting this horrible war.
In a minute, I want to turn to asking you to talk a little bit about the direct advocacy we are doing in Congress right now, because we do have an ask of our listeners that they would participate as advocates with us. And we know that the voices of people around the country do make a difference with their senators and their members of the House of Representatives. But before we turn to that, Hassan, I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit whether you've had some contact with people in Yemen directly, and whether there's any update. I know a lot of the work you do and that FCNL does, of course, is in coalition with partners who are focused on some of the same issues we work on. Do you have any update that's directly from the country?
I do. I am in contact with Yemenis on Twitter. I've got a lot of Yemeni American friends that also are updating me about what's happening, and they've got family in the region, and it's not good. What's happening in Yemen is a disaster. COVID-19, the cases that have been reported in the press, it's way higher than being reported in both the north and Houthi-held territory and in the south in the Hadi governments and the Southern Transitional Council territory. And unfortunately, Yemen is just really ill-equipped to handle this crisis because only 50% of the healthcare facilities are actually functional. And of the 50%, they're not even equipped to deal with COVID-19 because they lack the proper PPE, sanitation, medical equipment, in large part because of the Saudi blockade. So people are really scared, but they're also, a very resilient people, and they're coming up with solutions and coming up with pretty ingenious ways sometimes of creating their own ventilators. And so they're an incredibly inspiring population, but they are indeed suffering heavily through this COVID-19 crisis.
And I think that, we certainly have the perspective based on our vision of a world free of war and the threat of war, that the best thing we could do would be to end the deadly conflict of what's happening in Yemen, something that we've been working on for some time now already. I'm wondering if you could just take us through a little bit of where we've seen progress in terms of the US Congress. This has been what feels like a slow effort to try to get Congress to withdraw this US support for Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Yet we've had bipartisan success, and you've been part of that. And so have many of the people on this call as advocates. So could you just give us, you give us a little snapshot of where we are in that kind of march toward getting the US to withdraw its military support from this conflict?
Yeah, so there's been, you know, for all the tragedy, there's been some real hope in the fact that Americans are paying attention, and the U.S. Congress, in a bipartisan way, is paying attention to this issue. So that's given me a lot of hope, and it's been very inspiring to work on a lot of this stuff. So last year, in April of 2019, for the first time in U.S. history, bipartisan, bicameral members of Congress have essentially passed the Yemen War Powers Resolution to end unauthorized U.S. military support for the Saudi UAE coalition's war in Yemen. Unfortunately, it did get vetoed by the Trump administration, and that was definitely a setback. But we kept going. We tried to get more legislation, and we passed it through the House to the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, more language to end U.S. support for the war and even weapon sales too. But unfortunately, after a grueling 4 months of negotiations and conference, it was one of the last things that got stripped out of the conference committee. And in December, we learned that our legislation would not be retained and be, ending up in the final NDAA. So now, in that time, I think it's really important to know that while all of that process was happening and Congress was really forcing this issue, we saw a lot of movement and progress on the ground. We saw the agreement, the Stockholm Agreement, paving the way for a ceasefire in the port city of Hodeidah. That was signed the same day as Congress passed the legislation to end U.S. support for the war. Following that ceasefire, Congress forced more votes, and we saw the UAE draw down militarily. We saw a reduction in cross-border attacks from the Saudis and the Houthis, and a revival of negotiations between the warring parties. But unfortunately, as soon as that congressional pressure was taken off, we saw the violence start to increase in 2020. So the past 3 months, we've seen almost 300 airstrikes from the Saudi coalition alone. So right now we're looking at attaching more legislation to the FY 2021 National Defense Authorization Act. And for those who don't understand the alphabet soup, it's essentially the annual defense policy bill. It's the bill that funds and authorizes the Pentagon to operate.
Right. I want to note that we are going to open this up for questions. And if you have questions, we encourage you to put them in the chat so that we can address those in just a couple of minutes. But before we turn to that, we've talked about COVID-19 in Yemen, and we've talked in the past Thursdays with Friends about COVID-19 in the United States and how Congress is responding. How is Congress responding right now? And what's FCNL doing? Share a little bit about what we're trying to do to address this crisis, particularly in Yemen, in this war-torn country.
Yeah, so unfortunately, at this very critical moment for Yemen, with the news of cases of COVID-19 rising in the north and south, and after 5 years of brutal warfare, we're starting to see, we've seen a rollback and cuts and suspensions of millions and millions of dollars of assistance to Yemen. So right as they've needed this support, we've seen the administration actually make pretty deep cuts across the board, and it's not just happening in Yemen; it's happening all over the planet. So what we've tried to do is really restore USAID funding to Yemen, press the administration to expand the international support that we're giving to countries all over the planet. Because, like I said at the top of the program, we're not getting out of this until we solve the crisis globally, and we're all at risk. So we definitely, and obviously there's just the clear moral issue of trying to help people that are in need as well. So just today, we actually released an Ep.4 organizational sign-on letter that FCNL spearheaded, and we delivered it to every member of Congress and flagged it, and it was actually addressed to 12 members that are the chairs and ranking members of key committees. So what we're trying to do is really highlight this to the administration. And in the time we've been lobbying on this for a couple months at this point, since the original suspension in March 26th, we got a lot of members to speak out. I think we can log. I know for sure that at least 12 members that we spoke with actually reached directly out to State Department and USAID. Early on, we saw $500,000 released, which really wasn't going to do anything by the administration. But then we saw them release 1.7 million, and we're like, okay, well, we're getting somewhere. And just a couple weeks ago, we heard State Department announce that they're going to release 225 million in emergency food aid to the World Food Program. So I think it's slow going. It's not where we need to be, but I think there is some progress that we can point to here.
So one of the things that FCNL counts on is lobbyists who know what they're doing, like you, who are on the Hill. But we also count on our supporters from around the country. We count on our supporters who are financial contributors, and we're very grateful that allows us to continue our work. But we also count on our supporters who take action, who advocate with us. And I mentioned the advocacy teams before, who are really a central part of our grassroots structure. But there are people on this phone call who have taken action in talking to their members of Congress about this. And of course, we always have an ask of people, and today's no different. And so there is an action we'd like people to take that is on the website directly. I'm wondering if you could just say a couple of words about that so people have an understanding of what they'll be doing when they take that action after this call is over.
Yeah, absolutely. And the work by our entire advocacy team network on this and so many issues is really, I think, really powerful. And I just want to give so much credit to our entire network for all the work that folks have been doing. So after 5 years of just unimaginable human suffering, we use the phrase that Yemen can't wait, like hashtag Yemen can't wait. And that's just so true. And FCNL right now, again, we're working to end U.S. support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen. Congress can do that in a number of ways. We don't have to get into the weeds on the call, but all they need to hear from you is that you don't want your tax dollars going to support the Saudi-led war in Yemen, and you want to end U.S. military involvement in weapons. And that, I think the ask on the website just reiterates that, and just flagging it for your reps and your 2 senators would go a long way. And I actually, especially, sorry to,
No.
I think right now is a really critical moment. Saudi Arabia is getting a lot of bad press for so much going on, and they're, again, Republicans speaking out, Democrats speaking out. So I think we're prime, and I think there's a real shot here to get this over the finish line.
We're starting to see some questions, and I'm going to go to those questions right now. But what I want to also ask, I mean, we have a group of fairly sophisticated people who've been following this Middle East policy for a long time. So there's some questions about Israel and Palestine that we may get to, but I really want to talk about Iran for just a minute, because that's another area that FCNL has really focused on. And in talking to your colleague, Ethan Zad, I know you all have been talking to people about the issue of sanctions on Iran and the impact that that's having on that country, which is also suffering from COVID-19. So if you could just say a word about that, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, so, I mean, it's cases of COVID-19 are on the rise in Iran. It's very tragic. And all of this, when they need the support the most, the Iranian people are unable to get a lot of the medical equipment and supplies and things that they need because of the maximum pressure sanctions that the administration put on Iran a couple years ago. So we've been working a lot on the Hill to try to get members to speak out. We've worked on several letters in the NGO community and on the Hill. And I think, I can't say that we've ended the sanctions regime on Iran at all, and it breaks my heart. But we've gotten the administration to at least issue some guidance that will, where NGOs and other countries that want to do transactions with the Iranian central bank and want to provide this assistance, at least have this guidance from the administration. But it's really not enough. We've only seen like maybe a handful of transactions actually take place. And we're starting to see some progress regionally, where a lot like the UAE and Kuwait have given assistance, but really what has to end is the U.S. sanctions, or at least an easing of sanctions right now. So one of our strategies is to try to get Republicans to speak out about this issue, and we've been knocking door after door trying to find one, and working with conservative allies on and off the Hill to try to make that happen. So crossing fingers and toes, we're doing everything we can on that.
This is a very broad question, but we had a question come in about what's the situation? I mean, do we think that a war could be coming with Iran that would be between Israel and Iran that could involve the U.S.? And do you hear anyone talking about that on the Hill? I mean, that just seems so unimaginable in many ways, and yet we certainly hear escalating rhetoric.
I mean, I would never rule it out. It's always a possibility. There have been provocative actions by the U.S. and Iran in the Gulf. So oftentimes we don't, even if you don't intend to do something, a miscalculation can really quickly escalate. So we've worked really hard to try to pass the Iran War Powers Resolution. So we're watching this really closely. We got that through the Senate in March with 55 senators, 8 Republicans. So we're trying to, again, build bipartisan support for that. I take nothing for granted, especially as Israel's talking about annexing parts of the West Bank. So things that are incredibly unstable right now, all exacerbated by COVID-19. So we're watching that really closely, and we have a strategy to try to get legislation through this year's NDAA to prevent an unauthorized war with Iran as well.
And that issue, I want to ask you to talk just a little bit about this question of congressional role in authorizing war, because it's been such an important theme for our work at FCNL in your area of work, but throughout our foreign policy team. I also want to invite people to ask questions. We are going till 4:30, so we have a few more minutes to take some questions if people have any questions for us. And then I also want to note that Diana Obam, our director of foreign policy, put a great article that appeared in the New York Times this week. It's actually an article that quoted Anthony Weir, who does work for us on nuclear disarmament areas. But it's a great in-depth story about arms sales to Saudi Arabia that are causing civilian deaths. And then Stephen has put in a link to the action on the FCNL website. And I want to give also just a plug before we turn back to talk to Hassan about our virtual lobbying. FCNL really is relentless. And you hear that in Hassan's lobbying on this issue, but you also see it in our effort to try to really build out virtual lobbying. And so we have a virtual lobbying center, and Sarah Freeman-Wolpert, who works with our advocacy teams, is also now doing Learn to Lobby in 30 Minutes session on some days. So please go to that and you can learn more and participate in that. We have a whole set of programs that we're trying to offer to our network. So just keep looking at our website for not only what the next Thursdays with Friends will be, but also other events that FCNL is doing. Hassan, let me go back to you and talk a little bit about this question of Congress, the role Congress plays, because what we've seen is that we have a hyper militarized foreign policy in many regards. We have excessive amounts of money that go to the Pentagon every year, $735 billion last year. We have efforts to try to put more money into the Pentagon's budget in these coronavirus packages. We have a Congress that isn't necessarily authorizing any war, that's still relying on outdated war authority. How does this affect this work that you're doing specifically in the Middle East? What's the impact?
Well, unfortunately, I mean, the framers never intended for this runaway executive, and they put, Article 1, Section 8 in the Constitution to make sure that only Congress could declare war, and that the Article 2 powers of the president would only be to wage war to defend the U.S. or to fight a war that Congress had authorized. But with all of these unauthorized wars, essentially you've got the executive branch using the 2001 AUMF to conduct this wide-ranging war on terror in dozens and dozens of countries. The war in Yemen, it was never authorized by Congress. But so unfortunately, that's just kind of the reality. We've got the situation of perpetual, endless warfare. That said, we're using that hook of this is an unconstitutional, unauthorized war. And that's actually the hook that's actually helping us build bipartisan support for it. And we might all be coming from different angles. Some folks care about the humanitarian crisis. A lot of our progressive allies really care about the human toll of these wars. And I'm not saying that others don't, but a lot of our conservative or libertarian allies on the Hill on this particular issue, they really care about the constitutional war authority piece. So it swings the other way as well. So we're using that, trying to reassert congressional war authority to hopefully force votes and end some of these conflicts. And being able to use the War Powers Resolution that was passed in 1973 and, force vote after vote after vote, and then also forcing votes on the NDAA has really provided us a vehicle to actually force debates and, hold some accountability to these members. So I think that's also been really important.
So one of the things that I think is that I think our audience is hearing is, and I think people know, is our commitment to talking not to lawmakers on both sides of the aisle, and the essential need for that on this issue it's absolutely important and helpful that we have support from Republicans on this, whether it's from a humanitarian viewpoint or a libertarian viewpoint about authorization for the use of military force. And I think that's one of FCNL's strengths. I think we really have done a good job in reaching out, and that's been partly because of the people working in Washington, getting into those offices, but it's also because of all of you, because our friends in Indiana and Ohio and in Iowa are willing to reach out and talk to their own members of Congress, and that is just absolutely priceless in terms of FCNL's network. We're about out of time here. There are a couple of really big questions that people are asking. One is really about the candidates for president's position on the JCPOA. We know what Trump's position is because he's pulled the U.S. out of the JCPOA. Are you following what the presumptive Democratic nominee Biden will be doing around the JCPOA?
I certainly don't want to speak for the vice president, but I am pretty confident that Vice President Biden would be trying to re-enter the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. Under what circumstances or what the terms would be for that re-entry, I'm not exactly sure. But I have heard him, and I've even spoken with some of his foreign policy staff about this particular issue, and they definitely were committed to doing that, and more obviously, but.
And FCNL is very interested in being available to campaigns to be able to talk about these issues and provide education. And that's true for the campaigns for U.S. Senate or for House. So if you have a relationship with a candidate who's running, whether that's a Republican or a Democrat, we are happy to provide information, and you can feel free to refer people to our website to learn more about this. Obviously, we are a nonpartisan organization, and we will talk to any candidates who are interested in this. We're gonna need to wrap it up. I just want to say, and I want to offer you to say the last word here, Hassan. We also had a question about treaties, and of course, today we heard the news that this administration is pulling out of the Open Skies Treaty, and we're very distressed about that. You'll be learning more about that on our website. The JCPOA wasn't a Senate ratified treaty, but it was an essential step toward diplomacy and toward sort of the U.S. being a better player on the global stage. And so we are obviously very disappointed that this country has pulled out, and we will be continuing to work to try to always reassert diplomacy as a means to address the end of conflict. Hassan, last words. What would you like to share with people before we end?
I just wanted to say thank you to the whole FCNL family. I haven't been here too long. I got here in August, but it's really been one of the greatest places I've ever worked, and I really appreciate the entire network and all the support that our donors have given, and the leadership of Diane and Diana. And looking forward to more.
And we're grateful to have Hassan and a great team. You'll be meeting some other people on FCNL's team, and you can certainly read their writing and learn more about them by going to the FCNL website. And we hope you will take action on this issue of Yemen when you finish this conversation today. I also want to just again thank you for those of you who are able to make contributions to our work. It is absolutely essential, and we're so grateful for the financial support you give us as well. And with that, I'll say thank you for joining us tonight. This is really my favorite day of the week, Thursdays with Friends, and I look forward to seeing you again in 2 more weeks. And I hope you have a great Memorial Day weekend.